This is the Math Map Book Club, where ordinary parents encourage one another to develop an extraordinary appreciation of math. We love what we know and struggle over the unfamiliar. Through weekly conversation and exploration among friends, we can begin to enjoy ideas that seem difficult. Join our book club as we discover how math helps us to know God and to make Him known.
All right, I'm getting my screen shared, and I think Lee may be on and not quite able to join us, or not quite on yet, but she plans to be joining us shortly. So it is Wednesday. Yes, Wednesday, February 28th, but not the last day of February this year. And so that in and of itself makes today an interesting mathematical day, that those quarter days add up. And so we have an extra day this year. Just out of curiosity, is there anybody on the call that is a February 29th baby? It is interesting to me that probability suggests that I should know somebody, or at least have met somebody who is a February 29th birthday. But well, there we go. So I'm two people removed from somebody that has a February 29th birthday. So we are this week looking at lessons 15 and 16. And let's go ahead and jump in. So just like we would if we were in class, we're going to start every week by remembering what domain we're in and what dimension we're in. And so as we look at our math map, we're reminded that every week we're going to be looking at the naturals lessons. So those are the ones that are red. So for those of you who maybe have either downloaded the fractions at home, if you're part of the pilot, or you have access to an early copy of the complex, you'll see those different colors and how they give us a very clear cue every week which lesson, which domain we're in, as our lessons have those colors. And so we are indeed looking at the naturals lessons. And this week we're straddling our semester break. So we're looking at how we would finish the first semester with lesson 15 assessment, and how we would begin the second semester with lesson 16 triangles in circles. Are there any lingering questions that anybody has before we jump into lesson 15?
I have one.
Yes.
I am a PSS and have started my math map personal shopping appointments with the Rising Challenge A's. And when they're asking about when they can see the companion, which is in April, they're asking, did I hear this correctly? The definition of paid. Are they paying for their enrollment, or they're paying for their first semester? Did I hear that they can see the first 6 weeks, but the charts are embedded in week 7? That may not be your lane. I'm just wondering.
So no, I think everything will unlock week 7. So the companion is just one place. We don't have it differentiated for access by week. So there are differentiated weeks, but we have not differentiated access. So it will become, once they have paid their tuition and they are fully in the program, that's when they will be able to see the companion.
So
I
that
do
would
want
be
to,
the first semester payment?
yes, the first semester payment. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I do want to go ahead and take a minute just to address, because I know that some questions have come up about the companion. And I think this is a great time to really address something that came out of last year's pilot very, very strongly, that the self-contained nature of the curriculum is enough. That just about every single one of our pilot tutors who gathered with us to give feedback said, really, especially that first year, that first couple of years, you don't need the companion. It's a nice resource, but there's enough in the curriculum itself. That's all you need. We're really emphasizing using your classical tools. So instead of that didactic teaching where we go through and explain something, we're saying, okay, learn your grammar and then look at comparisons, right? We're going to use those skills of comparison and definition, circumstance, relationship, and so forth to develop our understanding. And so I just wanted to really share that with everybody, that the companion is going to be a great resource. It's going to give you the opportunity to see full-size solutions. So for those of you who have older eyes and want to be able to blow things up and zoom in, that's going to be helpful. It's going to have the answers to the careful calculations. So that will be a resource that people will probably want to go and look at. And it's going to have a really robust glossary. And so when you encounter a word and you're like, what does that word mean? I think that glossary is going to be a great resource. There's a lot more that's already in the companion and a lot more that is coming. Can everybody else hear me? Okay. So Carrie, I don't know. I'm going to let somebody else diagnose Carrie's problem as long as everybody else can hear me. So there's a lot more content that is in the companion, but especially that first year or two, I think that most people aren't even going to need to dive in to explore that because everything you need really is in the curriculum. Tutors, that's going to be where you're going to get your equipping. So there's going to be some things there that are going to be very helpful for you. And certainly, you know, it's a resource for everybody. But I just wanted to be really clear that the companion is not required for using the curriculum, that it really was designed to be self-contained, and our feedback has been that that's the best way to use it. So, all right, let's go ahead and look at lesson 15. So you're going to notice here that we do not have red on this page. And the reason for that is that the lesson 15 booklet and the lesson 30 booklet are designed to replace your blue book. And so whatever age you are, this is a book that you can use for assessment at the end of the semester. And a lot of times I think we get a little uptight when we hear that word assessment, but that could just be a mom making notes about what went well first semester, what you want to revisit second semester. It could be your child drawing a picture. It could be the more formal experience of sitting down in a Challenge A classroom to complete the Blue Book assessment. But the goal is that that booklet will have lined paper, it will have blank paper, it will have gridded paper, and so that students will be able to use that booklet for their Blue Book across all the strands. So instead of putting blank pages up on the screen for us to look at, I have gone ahead and pulled out the charts. So for those of you who have not seen a chart before, this is an example. It is in our transcendental blue to remind us that this is designed for all of our domains to be working through, that the ideas on these charts are representative of things that we're working towards with our transcendental students. These pages, especially the assessment pages, are really geared a lot towards parents and tutors, and then your older students who are working for that self-assessment. So instead of jumping in immediately here with familiar and unfamiliar, let's take a minute and really talk about what is the purpose of assessment. And I've pulled out 3 different people that we may want to consider what their purpose is: God's purpose, a parent's purpose, and a student's purpose. So I'm going to start by reading 1 Peter 1:6. In 1 Peter 1:6, Peter says that there is wonderful joy ahead, even though you have to endure many trials for a little while. These trials show that your faith is genuine, right? And so we see that God is giving us opportunities, right, for assessment, in this case, assessment of our faith, so that we can see for ourselves that our faith is genuine. So I'm going to turn it over to you now. What are your purposes of assessment when you think of that with your students?
I think for me, it's about knowing what she actually retained and understood. It's, where is she rhetorical? Where is she still on the grammar stage? Where is she still wrestling with the ideas? Just for me to see, to assess where she is.
Donna, you just like hit all of them there. Good job.
Yeah, and I would say as part of that, the idea is to know where we need to go next. So for me, it's never a hill to die on, right? I'll just use a different example. If I have my kids write an IW paragraph, I am not thinking that that is the end all and be all of our education in writing. And so therefore I have a different way of assessing it. What I'm looking to see is, did they understand this unit, or do I need to explain things better? And what do I need them to do better next time? And also, I know they have a limited capacity, so I may pick just one of those things to work on. And I do the same in math. And in fact, when my son was about 14, we had this conversation, and he said, "Why do I have to correct all the ones I missed?" And I was like, well, my thought on that is, if you never correct your errors, I don't know what we're doing here. So the purpose was not for you to get some kind of score on a math lesson for me. The purpose is for us to know what we know and be glad to know those things, and to figure out what we don't know and make a plan for how to conquer the things we don't know.
You guys have given some really great feedback there. And I think, somebody said celebrating, going back to our analogies of travel, right? When we think about going on a long journey, if you're going on a road trip, right? Are you continually assessing your trip? Are these still the best directions? If you use Google Maps, right, all of a sudden the road turns red in front of you, then you might go, oh, this may not be the best direction for me to go anymore. All of a sudden we may be thinking, I'm hungry, right? So my plan to stop for dinner at 6 was maybe not a good plan, because I'm really hungry now and it's only 4:30. So we're going to stop now. So we're always assessing, right? Donna, I love that. Yeah, I'm assessing the arrival time. Yes. Isn't that terrible that we're all like, let's beat Google? So we're constantly assessing where we are. We're constantly assessing what's going on. And I love that Jennifer said that, right? Not so we can give a grade, right? Who of us thinks that that we're going to get graded on our road trip, right? But we're constantly assessing, do I need to make a detour? Am I on the right track? Do I need to make adjustments? And so as parents, right, we need some external assessment for our students to help them that, right, as we look at that, right, how do we help them? How do we get them here? Do we need some course corrections? And so as we do that, we're always looking at, how can I do that? But I need that external assessment, right? Because I can think through myself, but they're going to need some help. And then how about our students, right? Especially with our, if we think about our challenge age students, what are we helping to develop in our students?
I always say that as a mom, I'm trying to work myself out of a job. So if I'm the only one assessing her, she's not learning to assess herself. But if she's learning to assess herself and correct and fix things, then that's the ultimate goal. I want her to be able to assess herself, fix what she needs to fix, and move forward when she needs to move forward, and backwards when she needs to move backwards.
Hard part.
I think some of my, oh, go ahead.
I was just thinking that this would be the first time a lot of our Challenge A students have been assessed in this way. So it is an opportunity for them to kind of reflect, do I know my multiplication tables? Maybe that's something I need to go back and really drill. And I try to have the kids tell me, what can I do better? What do you think went well? And then what can we do better? And having them figure that out on their own, because everybody has a different style and they may not be ready for it. I think my son is challenge B, and it's taken him a little longer to kind of figure out what he needed to do instead of what mom needed to do.
I think one of my favorite questions that I typically ask my Challenge A class is, what are you more familiar with now than you used to be? I think that giving the students the chance to say where they have grown has been huge, or even writing out, just like we would in Latin, we would write out a sentence and ask them not necessarily to be so quick to translate it, but what do you know about these endings? What do you know about this order? What clues do you see? And so in math, to say, what laws did you see being used? What parts of this equation can you name? Is it an equation or is it an expression? Just talk to me about what you know. Has taken a little bit of pressure. Actually, it's added pressure to some who just want to quickly write an answer, but it has taken pressure away from others who didn't feel that calculating was their strong part of this. And then also for me at home, knowing that my children know how to use their resources is something that I want to have them assess. Are you using the resources you have? Are you familiar with your resources? Do you know how to find things? And assess that for themselves.
I think you guys all have some really great things to share, not just about math assessment, right? But just assessment in general and how we are. I always think of it that we put that external discipline around our children when they're little so that they can develop that internal discipline. And so we start off with some external assessment that helps us to see what's going on, but they're going to learn through that to self-assess. And Alyssa, as you were talking about your son, it made me think about mine, and our themes in challenge, right? When we think of ownership, that can develop at different places, right? We might explore that in challenge A. It doesn't mean all of our challenge A students are going to take ownership over their learning. And but as we see our children growing, they're pulling from these themes and they're taking the self-assessment. And it's really fun to see them go from, okay, I know my strengths and weaknesses, but I don't know how to fix that, to, oh, now I see where my strengths and weaknesses are, and I'm going to use my strengths, right, to shore up my weaknesses. And so we see that growth. And that growth in our children, right, is perhaps the most important thing that we can do if we want to launch them for lifelong learners, right, is helping them to really be able to assess and in whatever situation they're in. And so it sounds like you guys are all doing a great job. And so that's one of the things that we're doing, really trying to encourage parents through these charts, is to really think of, right, why are you assessing? How can you assess? What are some things that you can assess that may be beyond just the grammar of the math map that you're in at this stage, right? How do we go beyond that? So on page 2, on chart 2 for lesson 15, we come back to assessment through the habits, the topics, and the canons. So I know it may be hard to read some of these things on the page, but what is familiar and what's unfamiliar on this page? And how could that help your assessment in your homeschool?
I see all those tools we've been learning. 5 core habits, 5 common topics, 5 canons of rhetoric. And the second part of your question, like, I love using the canons of rhetoric for assessment, because it's so, like, the 5 canons cover the 5 different places you might be having issues. Like, I haven't thought through how to use this with math, so I'm really looking forward to other people's answers. But like with an art grant proposal, for instance, did you spend the time you needed to with invention, researching, coming up with ideas, and did you arrange your presentation in such a way to, like, capture your audience at the beginning and then lead them through in order, and do you have all the parts in there, and then anyway, you guys know the 5 canons. But so I'm curious to hear with math, how do you do this?
I think in the past and with other curriculums that I've used, the way you assess math is really, it's just that relationship. Did you do the problem right? Did you do all the steps and come up with the right answer? And the math map is giving us the vocabulary to really ask the questions, um, define what you did, tell me about it, rather than just solve the problem. So it's giving us that vocabulary that we haven't had, because assessment in the past has been you got the right answer or not. And this makes it more about the process than the answer.
I think we're so used to having something on paper too that we don't feel like talking is the assessment, but it really is. It's, you know, it's sometimes it's easier for that student to verbalize that process than to actually write it down. And I think it's okay to let them have an oral representation of the process instead of having to write everything down. And especially for students who struggle with knowing what to write, we don't want to incorporate that struggle into their assessment of math. So having the conversation opens that up for them.
Babs, I love that because it reminds me that when I was Challenge A tutor, that really, especially when I had my own children in my class, that I really did my blue book on week 14, because that's when I knew what my blue book questions were, and we would discuss that in our class that day. And I would see through conversation who knew, right? Not because they'd gone home and crammed or studied or practiced, but who really knew what was going on, who could talk through and make connections. And so that was always like, I was like, oh, we're in a good place. I don't really need to look at your written blue book, right? You can do that, give that to your parents. But I know from our conversation in class who was really tracking with us and who was maybe struggling. And so I love that, Babs, that separating out sometimes the anxiety of writing something down from, hey, can you talk through this? Because that's what we're talking about, right? Our conversations. And so a lot of times we can have that conversation and do a lot of our assessment that way. There's some things here, just because Jana, you asked, so I'm just going to read some of the things that are here in case you guys probably all have smaller screens than me. So for activities, right, you could dictate math words and have them write down the symbol or the equation. You could do an editing exercise where they correct mistakes. You could check the facts with the flashcards. You could have them translate word problems into equations to solve, right? That might be expressing. You might ask them to write a word problem. Right? So those are some of your habits where you may take some of your grammar and explore that with your habits. These are just suggestions, right? These are not like, hey, do these. These are just some ideas. When we use our common topics, right? We could say, what do these terms mean? And there's your definition. How are some terms alike and how are they different? What else is the given term like, right? So you may say, we want to compare addition and multiplication, or addition and subtraction, or multiplication and exponentiation. By giving them some comparison questions now, we're really digging deeper. Do you understand what those are? For relationship, you might ask them why the associative property holds or doesn't hold for subtraction. Or you may ask them about side work, right? The things that we have to do before, but we can answer the question. For circumstances, maybe we're asking about operations that we're using for a problem, or whether the problem could represent a function or a relation. We could ask them to prove or demonstrate that their answer is correct when we want to get testimony and authority, right? Listing the laws. For the rhetorical student, right, you might look more holistically, right? Because now I want them to be able to put that all together. So my rhetorical student, I may give them, so here's the example that's on here. As Paul journeyed along the road to Damascus, he picked up a stone every 500 feet. Each stone weighed about 1 ounce. After a mile, he would give the stones he collected to one of the 3 men with him. If each man could carry 25 pounds of stones, how far could he travel until they could not pick up any more stones? Right? So there's a lot there to unpack. But a student would need to go through invention, right? What do I know? What do I need to know? Arranging, right? How could I arrange this information? How could I organize my information? Right? Then I'm going to maybe go through my common topics, right? What is it that I'm trying to do? How do I solve this now that I've got my information? What is the answer, right? There's my allocution, right? How do I communicate this problem? How do I give that back, right? Did I communicate my answer neatly, right? Did I deliver my answer in an appropriate way? And then through all of that, we're using our memoria, right? That's what our invention is, pulling from our memoria to help us do that. So does that help, Jana? Sort of some of the things
Very
that we're
much.
thinking through there.
Yes.
So again, notice none of those and really involved solving a problem. Most of those involved, right? What's your understanding of these things, with the problem solving really being the last piece of what we were doing. I know somebody, I don't think it was on the call, but somebody sent in a question asking about problem solving, right? How do word problems and problem solving? And this is where we come back to is, well, we're not just teaching a rote problem, right? There's an infinite number of word problems, and we're not saying, okay, we're going to teach you to understand these 10 types of word problems. We're saying we're going to use these skills of learning, right, to solve any problem that's in front of you. That's our goal. All right. Looking at page 3 of our charts here, I'm going to go kind of quickly so we still have time for lesson 16. The skills of assessment that we break out on this page are really composition, organization, and illustration. And again, those are broad and could be used for any of the other strands. When we talk about composition, we're usually thinking about words, communicating ideas with words. And so that could be copy work or dictation. Organization is that orderly and logical arrangement. So we may see that on graph paper, whether that's graphing, but it could also be that skill of arrangement and being able to keep my work nice and neat to come up with my solution. And then illustration, that's where we may use sketches or drawings or constructions, right? Those are the kinds of skills that we're looking at. And on this page here, I'm not going to go through it, but we try to give some ideas by domain of some of the things that your students may be ready to do. And we know that everybody is right, a little bit different. And so we've tried to give some concrete ideas, but also some ranges so that you can assess your student the way that they need to be assessed. And on our last page of the charts here, we have some sample questions. And so especially for parents and tutors the first year around, having some sample questions, right, can be helpful to sort of say, okay, well, how do we put all of this together? Right. So for example, as the composition question for complex, you might say, describe the following relationships: parallel lines, perpendicular lines, and oblique lines. And there's room there for the student to define that or to compare them. Right. So there's a lot of different things that we can do when we talk about those relationships. On graph paper, as an organization question, we could ask them to show how we would rationalize the denominator of 3a over 2i, or rationalize or realize a denominator. And so that's where they would be. And notice it says show how. It doesn't say to do it, but to show how. So we're emphasizing that you need to show all of your steps, that is really the question here, is what are the steps we need to take? An illustration question might be to create your own illustration to show that anything to the 0 power is always 1. Okay. So again, we may not have thought of how do you illustrate that, right? How do you draw a picture for that? And so that gives them an opportunity to think about a big idea in a little bit of a different way, in order to express their own understanding, right? Not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but how do they understand that?
Percy, I wanted to read something really quick from this page. Well, actually, it was page 3. But it was about the section that has expectations for digits, naturals, and integers, sorry. Because I think this is a question that parents are going to have if they're using the naturals at home with their student, and we don't have booklet 15 up there because it's just lined paper. And it says, formal assessment of the youngest students is not the primary goal of the Blue Book. For these students, the Blue Book is an opportunity to practice sitting and working quietly for a short amount of time. These students may be asked to trace or copy short ideas or to color or draw pictures. The Blue Book can also be used as the student's written record of accomplishments made this semester or goals for the following semester. So I just wanted to read that because I think parents are going to, have questions about how they assess their naturals kid. And, I like the first line, like formal assessment of the youngest students is not the primary goal, but just had a couple of ideas in there too.
Thanks, Babs. I appreciate you highlighting that. And you're right. I mean, we want students to see assessment as a positive, right? This is a positive thing. When God says, I'm testing you so you can see that your faith is genuine, he doesn't need to see that our faith is genuine. He sees our hearts and he knows, but he wants us to know, right? He wants us to be encouraged, right? He gives us, our faith is tested so that we can be encouraged that it's genuine, right? So we don't have to sit there and go, well, I'm not really sure. I'm like, right? We can go, oh, wait a minute. Like I went through this thing and I was faithful and God was faithful. And so I've proven to myself that I'm faithful. And I also have a testimony of God's faithfulness, right? And so it's a good thing, right? Shauna, as you just said, right? He's blessing us through that assessment. And so that's the gift we can give to our children, is to see testing in the same way, right? As a blessing and a benefit there. All right, so let's pause for just a moment. Are there any questions about the curriculum, the rollout, what's going on, or what we've talked about so far? Does anybody have any last things they'd like to share before we start our second semester?
I guess I have a question. As we start the rollout with 7th graders, I mean, grades aren't that important. I've always told parents in 7th and 8th grade, they're getting used to having strands that would be gradable in high school, but how do we explain it to the parents? If, I'm looking ahead into I think, what is it, binomials through transcendentals are the high school years. Will there be something that comes out beyond just the week 15 and week 30 for the assessments to help parents develop a grade for their child?
So I may not be the best person to ask about grading, because here's how I see assessment and grading. One, I've been very intrigued by movements at the university level to move away from grading. And so they really call it this thing called specification grading, and where you say, okay, if you do X, right, or you achieve at this level, you get a C. And if you want a B, this is what you have to do. And if you want an A, this is what you have to do. And so it's laid out really clearly for students that it's less about right answers and more about them choosing, how deep do I want to go? How hard do I want to work? Right. And they have some ownership then in their grading. And alongside of that is actually students grading themselves, and professors usually find the studies that they've done find that students usually grade themselves more harshly than their professors would. And so when students are asked to self-assess and give themselves a grade, they usually grade lower than the professor would if the professor was assigning the grade. So I've been influenced by this idea of moving away from grades based off of, right, did you just know it and get it right? I also think that as a homeschool family, there's really no reason, even if I have a test, right? If we're working on something and I have an idea of what we want to achieve, if we don't get that result the first time around, right? What do we all do? We go back and we say, well, let's look at that again. Okay, yeah. Oh, well, you got it. Great. Finally, you got it. And so every kid should have an A, right? Because we have that beauty that we are not um, teaching to a test that they can only take one time, but we are teaching them to achieve understanding, and we continue to work with them until they get there. So in my mind, every child that's homeschooled in that way, right? In that manner where we're saying we're working towards this level of understanding should get an A. So what's the differentiator? In my homeschool, it was really about your effort, your character, right? The work that you put into it. And so if if I know that you know how to add two numbers together and you just are sloppy and you don't really care to be accurate, it like that to me is what lowers your grade, not whether or not you knew how to add the two numbers together. Um, if you're like, I only feel like doing half of the page worth of work, well, that's not A level work. But man, if you're working hard and you're doing everything I've asked for you to do, but you're just a slower calculator, and so I give you an hour to work on a drill sheet and you don't get to the end of that drill sheet, but you are working really hard and you were being really attentive, well, you may get an A even if you only got 3/4 of the page done. And so I know that that is not necessarily helpful because I know people are, especially with math, we're used to having a test that says you knew how to do A and B and C, and therefore you get this grade, right? This, we're checking it off. And I would just encourage us to take a step back from that and go, wait a minute, why are we using the math map? What is the purpose, right? We're trying to see the unseen. We're developing our language, our grammar. And am I making progress towards that? And certainly there are ways that parents could use the careful calculations pages to have a more objective type of grade. Certainly they could structure their blue book in such a way as to have a more objective type of grade. But when I talk to people, I'm kind of like, hey, me, like, are you making the progress that you want to make? And is your child working hard on it? And what grade do you think they deserve? What grade do they think they deserve? I always included, especially my older children, in that conversation because it was amazing to me that I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm going to give you an A. And they'd be like, no, that was really like a B plus, mom. Okay. So anyway, that was a lot more to say than, and maybe not as helpful, but I think that as we roll out the curriculum, I think we're going to find that we're going to find some freedom in how we assess mathematics, and we look at it more holistically than perhaps we have in the past. And, I shouldn't say this, and unfortunately this is going to be recorded, but I will say it because if you've talked to anybody who is associated with a public school these days, and I can tell you from my experience teaching in a private school, grades are inflated all the time in those schools. And I think that homeschoolers on average are much harder graders than any of our traditional schools. And so no homeschool parent should penalize their child just because they're homeschooled and they have parents who have high expectations. So anyway, that was my diatribe for the day. Any other questions before we move on to lesson 16? All right, as we look here, one of the things I'm going to point out to you is that our title here is triangles and circles. What we are really talking about is trigonometry. And so this is an example of where Lee has chosen not to use a word that may come with some baggage, and instead to use words that describe what we're doing. And so a lot of the times when we are looking at trigonometry, we can do so by looking at triangles in the coordinate plane within the unit circle. And so that's where that idea of triangles in circles comes from. So let's go ahead and pause for a minute and share things that are familiar or unfamiliar, or you can certainly address those questions I've put on the screen. But what do you see on this page that you'd like to share?
The degrees of angles are familiar. The pi, maybe not so much. Pi over 2, pi over 3.
Hypotenuse is a familiar term.
Good.
The sine opposite hypotenuse and cosine adjacent hypotenuse are familiar, and theta. And
Those
the
are
angle.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say those are familiar, but I'm not used to seeing it with opposite and then angle theta. I'm used to just seeing opposite over hypotenuse. So I understand what it means. That's interesting.
I think counting blocks to get a length is familiar.
Is the Q1 at the top box have to do with the quadrant?
It does.
Okay.
Looking at that top, Babs, you said that the degrees were familiar. Why are they familiar?
Because we memorized them from triangles. I guess that's when I memorized them.
Measure.
Protractor.
Yes.
The one on the left with the angles in terms of pi and fractions are becoming familiar and starting to make sense after a few times through and after spending time with the unit circle and even drawing on our foundations knowledge of 2 pi. That the whole that the circumference of a circle is 2 pi r, and in a unit circle r is 1, so that's wonderful. But I've started to become more comfortable and understand more about what these fractions mean and what it represents, and that's pretty exciting.
So 2 pi is all the way around, so pi would just be halfway around, and pi divided by 2 would be a quarter. Thank you, Jill.
Jill, that's actually what I really needed as well, is to understand that half of a circle is pi. And then everything else started to make a lot more sense then.
Yes, it has helped me a lot just to think about, if I'm cutting it into 6 pieces, what would that look like? If I'm cutting half of an actual, like a pumpkin pie or a cherry pie or whatever, not pie, but yum, pie. If I'm cutting that in half into 6 pieces, where would that be? Or into 4 pieces or into 2 pieces, what would that translate to? And it has, I now love the unit circle, and I've been looking for like a unit circle shirt that is approachable so that it need it to be enough that other unit circle fans will nod and smile. I don't need it to be something that I might have to make my own.
Well, I love the conversation that you guys just had about things that felt familiar because you've used them before, and you had an idea of what they were, but now how you were connecting what was familiar to what feels less familiar. And so those degrees, and now looking at that and going, oh, wait, these line up. And so these are my radians. And what does that look like? Oh, it looks like the whole circle, right? That we're building this understanding. That's what comparison does, right? I could sit here and have you memorize that 90 degrees is pi over 2, and 60 degrees is pi over 3, and 45 degrees is pi over 4, and 30 degrees is pi over 6. And we're going to have our younger students memorize that. But that active comparison that you were just doing, whether that's to pumpkin pie or here on the page, right? It's that comparison when the light bulb goes off, right? Because now I'm going, oh, I'm taking these two ideas that seemed dissimilar and I'm connecting them. And so now I have understanding. That's a beautiful thing. All right, let's look at, oh, go ahead. Did somebody have a question?
I was just going to say it's an excuse to eat pie. So,
Yeah.
you know.
That's always a good thing. So let's go ahead and look at page 2. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to our question and ask you what kinds of natural phenomena can act like the sine wave that we have at the top. So that top right, as you look at that, that is a graph of sine of theta. And so our angle is our independent variable. It's on our horizontal. And then the sine value of each of those degrees is our vertical, up and down. And so as we look at that, what kinds of natural phenomena act like that?
Music waves.
Good.
I was going to say
Wave.
sound waves. Right.
Parody, I love that. A tufted titmouse is flight. I like that. Taking out a blanket, that's good. Is there anybody who thinks they could generalize what we're talking about when we think about things acting like a sine wave? What happens if we went before the 0 or after the 360? What happens?
Well, essentially, we're going around the circle more than one time. So 360 is all the way around the circle once. And then if we kept going, the number would be getting bigger, but we would still be at those same places, the radican places on the unit circle. We're just plotting it out extended on a line that keeps going.
Good. So that pattern that we see there would just continue, right? So if we think about shaking out a blanket, right, we have limits, right? The highest that blanket could go is the length of the blanket, and the lowest it could go is the length of the blanket, right? So there's limits there. It's never going to go farther up. So as I do this, right, I see that shape going up and down, right? Kari, excellent, that repeated pattern. So our sine function here, our sine wave, is really important because anything in our world that we want to model or talk about that has that kind of pattern, we can look at it as, right, what does that look like? That periodic type of function, like waves or pendulums, or all of those different things that can have this kind of periodic behavior. So let's look at a couple of other functions. Is cosine like sine? Is it continuous? Are there any excluded values?
It looks continuous to me, but I don't have enough experience to know if there are excluded values. It doesn't look like it, but I could have incomplete grammar.
No, you're right, Jill. Have confidence. There aren't any right? There's no open circles, there's no asymptotes, that every angle has a corresponding cosine, right? Every single angle has a corresponding cosine. So let's practice, and this is something we could do with our younger students or our older students. What about finding the cosine of 0 by using this graph? What is the cosine of 0? One, right? So let me turn on my pen, and there we go. All right, so here we go. If I start here at 0, my value is 1. When I get to 90, what's the value?
0.
0. If I keep going to 180, what's my value?
-1.
-1.
-1. How about at 270?
0.
And at 360?
1.
And if I kept going, and I kept going down here to 450, what would it be?
0.
0, right? And so we could keep going, right? Because it's just going to keep going like that. And we know those values. Could we estimate what the values are in between?
Yes.
Yep. All right. And so we see every angle is going to have a different value in there, but we can pick off the graph those key places.
And we know that it's always going to be between 1 and -1.
That's right. Isn't it nice to know that there's limits?
Yes.
Sometimes, like, it's nice to know that there's boundaries that we're going to stay between. Right? And a lot of things in our world, right? When you think about electricity depends on this nice even pattern, right? And when we think about, like, when they say that there's like a surge, right? Something happening, what's happened? I've lost my nice even curve, and it's doing something shocking to us. Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
That was good.
So now that I've drawn that out, although I didn't draw it out beautifully, does that cosine curve look similar to or familiar compared to another curve that we've just looked at?
Yes.
Which one?
It was the sine, wasn't it?
It was the sine. And what do we notice when we look at cosine?
It's cosine.
Right? It's cosine. And this is right. We're not necessarily doing a lot of this here, but even if we just look a little bit, when we look at 45 and 45, it equals 90, 30 and 60 equals 90. And if we went back to lesson 12, where we were talking about, lesson 12, also lesson 10, where we were talking about angles, when two angles sum to 90, we call them complements, right? They complete, right? So we think of this complement. So if I was to look at these two graphs on top of each other, we're looking at the acute angle of a right triangle. And so the sine of one angle, right, is the cosine of the other angle. And so now we see where this shift comes from and why these graphs look so similar. So there's a lot of ideas that we can unpack here over the years, not with our 5 and 6 year olds, but I just want to point out that even just looking at the simplicity of this page where we're just tracing and we're copying and we're doing simple sums, that the depth of ideas that are there, we can continue to explore those using our skills of learning. Right, in our last page, page 4, right? So Jill, because you were so confident that cosine was continuous, is tangent continuous? Or are there excluded values?
There are asymptotes, so it gets close but never touches the 90 degrees and the 270 degrees. So it is not continuous.
Excellent. Do we still see a periodic pattern?
Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm. But you're right. And so again, we've talked about asymptotes before with other lessons. A lot in lesson 11, we've talked about those asymptotes. And so we see that here. So this is an example of how we're going to continue to review these ideas throughout the year, right? So we might introduce something in one lesson, but students are going to see that again and again, even for our younger students, because if we look at that middle left box, um, right, this is reading that our parents are going to do here, right? Can the curve touch the asymptote? And as Jill just pointed out, no, right? But even just by looking at that, our younger students can engage with that idea. What does that line look like? And I can let you know that the curriculum designers, Lee and the curriculum designers, have worked really hard to use different lines, different types of dotted lines as visual cues for students. So out in the wild, if you were doing math anywhere else, people are not going to sit there and tell you how to draw a dashed line, that a dashed line is going to be a dashed line. But in the math map, if you compare those two boxes, you'll notice that we have different dashed lines. And so the one on the left is an asymptote. And the goal there is that when students see that, it's going to be clear to them that this is an asymptote. Whereas on the other side, it is a line of reflection. And so now we can cross. So we're comparing those, but we're also trying to give students a visual cue of what those lines mean. So again, out in the wilds of mathematics, it doesn't matter how you dash your lines, but that's one of the details that Lee has tried to really pay attention to help students keep track of those ideas as they work through the curriculum. All right, are there any final questions before we wrap up for today?
I have one question. Because you were mentioning the quadrant on page 2 or page 1, and then we were looking at the bottom of page 2, and it was showing the quadrants. Are they always numbered counterclockwise that way? Yes.
They are, yes.
Circle. Okay. I was just curious. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And there's a picture of the unit circle in the Scribbler's booklet in case you have that.
All right, I've got to go back and look at the soccer player in the airplane. Yeah, I would say that I'm just not drawn to scale. I would probably say, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I don't really know, except that you're right, the scale does look a little funny. So I know that Christine is on. So Christine, if you want to make a note of that and just maybe clarify there what those images, if there's a better way we could do that. Thanks, Christine. There you go. Christine says it's already been fixed. Any other questions or comments or things you'd like to share? So as a last note before we jump off, I just thought I would share, I don't think Jill will mind me sharing this, that last week we were talking about tangents and how there has to be, right, for us to see that circle and that tangent line, there has to be this accumulation of points that we can't really see just one point of intersection. So there has to be some critical mass of points there for us to be able to see that. And as we were talking, she said, well, gosh, that's like God, right? The God is always at work in our life. He's always doing things. He's always active. But sometimes we need this sort of critical mass of what he's doing for us to go, oh, God is at work. that we don't always notice those small little things, right? That there has to be this critical mass of God's work in our life for us to go, oh, he's at work, or to get our attention, right? That we're not always, he might like tap you on the back of your head and you don't notice. And so as he keeps tapping you, finally you're like, well, oh, wait a minute, what's going on? And I loved that conversation I had with Jill, because it was just such an example of how God can teach us something through mathematics that may not be about anything grand, the order of the universe or how he built the universe, right? But he taught us something through our understanding of dimensions and what we can perceive and what we can't perceive, that helps us to understand our relationship with him. And so, for those of you who are still maybe wondering, well, how is math going to help me to know God? I just think that that's such a that was to me just a really pertinent example that, right, had nothing to do really with math, but in pursuing math, God gave us a truth about him and our relationship with him. So we'll end there. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to next week. We will be wrapping up the second dimension next week. So we're already there, and I will look forward to seeing you all next week.